Welcome to Part 2 of Module 6. In Part 1, we discussed general principles of data review and the data review plan. In this Part 2 lecture, we're going to focus on using the data review plan and the edit checks to identify and resolve data discrepancies and queries. In this module, I want to prepare you to use the data review plan and the data quality checks to identify discrepancies and generate and resolve queries. So we're going to touch again on the data review plan. We're going to talk about what is a discrepancy versus a query, discuss self-evident corrections, look at the data quality and query resolution instructions for your assignment. We're going to actually talk about using the data quality application within REDCap in the query resolution application in REDCap. We're going to talk about writing good query text, documenting the resolution, and updating your database and CRF when you're done. As I mentioned in the Part 1 lecture, I've created a very simple data review plan for CLR Mock 001. Hopefully you already know what I'm about to say. You can find this document in the Data Management Study file. And I want you to note the document name and version number are going to be present here, just like we talked about all the way through in terms of version control. You need to review this entire document. Some of it we'll be using to perform our data review and query generation activities in this module, and also I'm going to have questions on the midterm exam that go back to the data review plan. Let's start by clarifying some terminology. Many people use the terms discrepancy and query interchangeably. I find I often do so myself, but there's actually a difference between the two terms. A discrepancy is simply an outlier or a piece of inconsistent data. When we review a discrepancy, we might find that that data is actually valid. For example, we may have set our height range to assume all of our patients will be between 5 and 6 feet. But if a patient is noted as being 4 feet tall or 48 inches, that would be discrepant. It's out of range. However, if we look at the CRF, we might see a note from the site that says, yes, this height is out of range, but it's correct for the patient. In other words, the data is discrepant, but it's still valid. On the other hand, we may review the CRF and find no notations regarding the height, in which case we might issue a query to the site to clarify whether or not 4 feet is a valid entry. That's a query. So in the top image we talk about the ranges, or you can see an example of the ranges we have in REDCap, and in the bottom image you can see how the discrepancy was identified and then how I queried the site on it. You may hear the term self-evident corrections. Self-evident corrections were used a lot when we were dealing with paper CRFs and the process of getting the site to confirm and make a change on the case report form was a little bit slow. They're not used as much anymore because we can ask the site to make the change in the EDC system. But I still think you need to know about them, so we're going to talk a little bit about when they are appropriate to use and what they are. In many cases, we can review the data in context, and we can determine that there's enough information there to make what we call a self-evident correction. That simply means the data on the case report form itself is going to report our conclusion about what a data point should be. So in some rare cases, we're able to look at the data and determine that an inconsistent value can be corrected without modifying or creating new data or results. Remember, we never create data. That's done by the site. As Proska notes in your assigned chapter on data cleaning, the use of self-evident corrections is tightly restricted. There's a little quote here that says, self-evident corrections allow data management to resolve unambiguous inconsistencies in the data, but this is tightly restricted and limited to a study-specific predefined list. So remember, we don't create data ever, but in some very rare cases, we can determine that the CRF actually tells us what the data is. When you read the data review plan for CLR Mock 001, you're going to see that I have a few general conventions that note that self-evident correction policies will be detailed on a form-specific basis. So we do this on a form-by-form basis and an event-by-event basis. I've included an example of a typical self-evident correction. In this example, you can see the site stated that the patient did not return for visit 4, and yet they supplied a visit date and other data for the visit. So our edit check program flagged that inconsistency as a discrepancy. This would be a case where we might say, yes, we can tell because data is present that the answer to did the patient return for visit 4 should simply be changed to yes. So if we take this to the next logical step, we're going to complete our self-evident correction by changing the visit yes/no field to yes. We haven't actually created or changed the patient data generated for that visit, so we can say that this is simply a self-evident correction and establish a policy that in other cases, if visit data is present, then we can update that did patient return for visit response from no to yes. But we need to document the reason for that change, and we also need to make sure that the database is updated so that everything matches. In the screenshot on the top, you can see my comment that I updated the visit yes/no per policy for self-evident correction. In the screenshot on the bottom, you can see that I updated the database to say yes. So we've closed that loop. Now that we've discussed the difference between discrepancies, self-evident corrections, and queries, let's talk about how we will use the edit or data quality checks to identify discrepancies. Normally, instructions for utilizing database applications would be documented in a work instruction or a department operating procedure or SOP rather than in a study-specific document. But for our class, I've created a hybrid document that tells how to use the application and also walks you through your Module 6 assignment. You wouldn't really see this in real life, but it's going to work for us in this classroom setting. As always, that document is stored in the Data Management Study file, and it has a version number and a title. Remember, you need to read this document and watch the instructional video prior to trying to do the assignment in REDCap. You will not be able to perform the assignment if you do not read this completely and watch the video instructions. We're going to work with the REDCap data quality application. REDCap refers to edit checks as data quality checks. When you want to run these data quality checks, then you can choose the execute option to do so. So we'll talk a lot about executing the data quality application. The written and video instructions that I provided will explain how to access the REDCap data quality application and execute the data quality checks. You can see little screenshots I've included here from REDCap itself that show you where to find the application and what your data quality work panel will look like. You're going to be assigned specific checks that I want you to run on the data you entered in Module 5. But feel free to play around in the database and run as many or as few of these application checks as you want to on your own. It's good practice, and I think you'll have fun doing it. We're also going to be using REDCap's query resolution application. REDCap calls its query resolution application Resolve Issues. So when you look at this little application screenshot up here, you'll see next to data quality is another blue label for Resolve Issues. Again, the terminology we're going to use is that you execute that option. So when you want to look for your Resolve Issues or Issues to Resolve, you'll click on that screen. The written and video instructions, again, are going to explain how to access the query resolution application in order to generate and resolve your assigned queries. Remember, you're assigned specific queries to generate and resolve. It's all in the instructions. But again, feel free to play around with the database, and you can generate and resolve as many additional queries if you would like. Remember, though, only resolve queries for patients that you have entered. If you resolve queries for another student's data, they will not be able to complete their assignment. I want to add a few comments on writing good query text. You want to try to be clear and consistent and concise where you can. This will increase the chances the site coordinator will actually understand your query and be able to respond to it in one shot. For example, you might say the diastolic blood pressure of 180 exceeds the expected normal range. Please review blood pressure value and confirm value if it's correct, or update the value if it is incorrect. This is opposed to, please review the blood pressure value. The first example identifies the data value in question, diastolic blood pressure, and the problem, 180 exceeds the range, and it also outlines what you need the study coordinator to do. Confirm that 180 is correct, or provide a corrected value. Whereas the second example simply asks the site to review the blood pressure without explaining which value, what problem, or how they want to address it or need to address it. Many systems, CDMS systems, will allow you to build in a query script for each edit check. So it'll generate that script automatically, and then that can be modified by the person generating the query if it needs to be customized. This reduces the time needed to write the query, and it facilitates use of a consistent format. One thing we also need to make certain of is that we document our resolution. So a discrepancy might be resolved without a change to the CRF or database, or it could require a change to either the CRF or the database. Using our previous scenario where a blood pressure of 180 occurs, the site might respond that 180 is a valid value. Well, in that case, you don't need to change the CRF or database, but you still want to document the resolution of that query. Otherwise, it's going to continue to come up every time you run your edit checks. You do this documentation by entering some notation or text that the site was queried and that they confirmed the value. On the other hand, the site might respond that the value of 180 was an entry error and that the actual value should be 120. In that case, you would document the site's response and the update that they need to make to the database, which is 120. The update would be documented in the audit trail, so you would find that, but you also need to document the reason the update was made. In both cases, you would enter a note describing the resolution to the query. Then you'd have your documentation, so the next time somebody looks at the data, they understand why it was handled the way it was. I've included a screenshot that shows some examples. Let's extend the concept of documentation to how we actually update the CRF in the database. Any changes to the database or the CRF have to include the identity of the person making the change and the date of the change. If you're making a change to a paper CRF, you're going to need to include your initials as well as the date you made that change. This should always be done in indelible ink, not in pencil, and not in a type of ink that will leak or smear if it gets wet. And you should never obscure the original data value. The screenshot at the top shows a correction made to a case report form page. Here, I crossed out the visit value of 5 with a single line, ensuring you could still read the original value. Above it, I noted that the visit should actually be 3, and then I provided my initials and the date I made the change, all in ink. The screenshot at the bottom shows the audit trail entry that was created when I updated the visit yes/no field. You can see the audit trail documented the time and date of the change, my username, the action that occurred, an update to the record, and the change that I made. So once again, you've closed the loop on your documentation, you have a record of it in the audit trail, and we know who did it and when and why. Give yourself plenty of time to do the Module 6 assignment. You're going to need to read a lot of documentation, and then you're going to have to do some hands-on practical work in REDCap, and it's going to be a little bit hard. This is a complex assignment, so do not wait until the last minute. First, you're going to need to review that data review plan. You're going to make sure you're looking at the instructions document. You need to watch all of the videos and then follow the instructions. After you've completed the assignment, I want you to go to the assignment tab and just enter a little note confirming that you have done the work, and I'll be able to provide you with a grade. Thank you.